So I was gonna get on here today and pretty much go the fuck off, spaz the fuck out, a rant, if you will. But then I thought about it, and I'm like, nah, I'm still gonna cover the things that I wanted to cover, but I want to take some time and put it together in a more coherent fashion, to where I don't say some shit that gets me banned or whatever, which is not hard to do these days. So with that being said, let me just say, fuck you, Huffy72, and fuck you, Tom McDonald. That's all. Back to the interview.
World. And I suspect he was placed near Manson to try to get some kind of information from him as well. And in later years, I found out that Manson absolutely detested Timothy Leary. And in the early 80s, I got to know Leary slightly, but that's a whole other story. But it sort of confirmed my beliefs that he was, an extremely unethical person who was up to much more than we could imagine as well. But, I think it's interesting that he's who opened the door to my looking into this. So then, if you have any questions about that, we can cover it. But
Sure, I do have one actually. There have been many comments made by some authors that Leary was actively involved with either the CIA or the FBI, and in more ways than just drug experimentation. And I want to ask you if you believe that was the case.
Yes, I absolutely believe it, and I think there's a lot of circumstantial evidence to prove it. From my encounter with him, I really do believe he had some kind of intelligence agency background. A few simple things we can get into without digressing away from the Manson case, which is the central focus, but in a more overarching way, the real story we're talking about is what was the counterculture really, and how did the mass media report it, and how did its changing of the mass media coalesce with the way the intelligence agencies shifted public opinion at the time. So that's the larger story here. So I think it's significant. I personally believe there's plenty of reason to believe that Leary was working on the margins of the CIA. I don't think he was employed by them, but I think he was a sympathetic agent to them from many things I encountered and many things I've encountered in my research. For one thing, his employer at Harvard, which, that's no secret, Harvard and Yale have always been the main recruiting center in those days of the intelligence community, as they euphemistically call themselves. His employer at Harvard was definitely a CIA agent, and I'm pretty certain that the early LSD experiments Leary was doing with psilocybin, mescaline, and LSD at Harvard were sponsored, and that he shared the research with the CIA, which I'm not trying to make that sound sinister, because at that time, most of American academia was working closely with the intelligence agencies. And I'm not suggesting it like in some kind of Illuminati, ridiculous sensationalist theory. It's just a fact that the science departments of United States universities were working very closely with the Pentagon and with the CIA, because it was the Cold War, and there was a lot of research going on in academia that was useful to intelligence and military application. So I'm certain that Leary was on the margins of it, and I think he was deeply involved with some sort of CIA activity, but I think it would be speculation and also too complicated to get into here. But that's my personal belief from knowing him. I think he was a completely unethical person who would have gone whichever way he was being paid.
I think that's an important point to make, and I'm really glad you made it, Nicholas. While there's a counterculture here, what we now know is that the lines between the counterculture and the national security complex were blurred at best. Now, when a countercultural movement begins questioning its own leader, so to speak, and then you throw in copious amounts of LSD, it's not a surprise that confusion and paranoia reigned supreme in 1969.
Well, yeah, I think what we're looking at, if we look at the bigger story, that the Charles Manson case is perhaps just the most dramatic and sensationally covered of the various facets of what the 1960s were really about. And that is really what this story actually comes down to, is the interface between, I want to put this very carefully, because again, I'm not talking about some kind of wild conspiracy theory. I'm talking about the normal activities of intelligence and law enforcement and the way that they interconnect with the criminal underworld. That's really what happened in the Manson case, and that's what Leary was involved in. And I think it all has a lot to do with the outlawing of LSD in 1966, which, as I've said before, and I make it clear in my book, The Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman, the Manson crimes and several lesser-known crimes that occurred in the counterculture hippie milieu in the 60s should best be compared to the crime wave that occurred during Prohibition. And I don't think people really get this connection, so I want to try to explain that, is that when the United States government made the lunatic decision during Prohibition to ban alcohol, of course, it did not lead to an upsurge in morality. What it did was give organized crime a huge industry, which was bootlegging and the distribution of illegal alcohol. And that led to, all kinds of mayhem, as we know. That's what created the crime wave of the 1930s. The same thing happened in the 60s when the federal government banned research and use of psychedelics and turned usage of them into a major felony. The mafia and various other organized crime factions moved in to sweep up the profits. And that is what led to the Manson murders, basically, this competition between drug dealers, just exactly as what would have happened in Chicago during the 1930s between various gangs vying for control of bootlegging, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. Let's turn back to Topanga Canyon and the rise of the rock culture of the late 60s.
Right.
Now, I've always believed the culture and environment tell us much about a story, and especially about this story. So what was it about the Topanga Canyon scene that affected Manson and his community so heavily?
Right. Well, I should say this as a kind of proviso to that, is my primary interest at first when